Good afternoon. Today we have a webinar about, as a main topic, the inflation and how we are currently observing the current wave, which is a bit a gray zone, currently followed the initial shocks that we have observed the last years. The question is a bit how this is all evolving, and for that we have developed some comments, but also we will encompass this within the global methodology that we have developed about leading indicators, which is both a product and a methodology that can help companies in better assessing the turning points into your business, and this within an overall evolution of both inflation and macroeconomical effects within the current business that you are dealing with. So my name is Christophe Longeville. I am part of the management team within Solventure, and I'm dealing, among other things, with the own solutions that we develop, which is a leading indicator solution, an advanced analytic solution. So as I said, that can help you better anticipate the turning points into your business. I am joined by one of our senior data scientists, which is Gillian Verstraeten. Gillian is also a demand planning expert, the senior expert, and Gillian has obtained also a PhD in operations research. So let me comment on the agenda that we have developed for you. So I'll give you a small introduction about the methodology that we have. Gillian will afterwards bring this into a tangible perspective with some examples that he will give, and is also within the inflationary context that we are still observing. He will bring the basics of inflation a bit to everybody's memory and insights, and then he will explain what we are currently observing, what we think the type of outlook is that we might expect, but also how it is impacting typically your business, and this from a methodology that we have developed, and how you can anticipate to the effects based on a number of solutions that we have developed that can better help you to deal with all these effects into your own value chain. So if you allow me, Gillian, I'll go to the next slide. And so it's basically, let me give you a small introduction about why we have developed this solution about leading indicators. I think it's an open door, of course, that a company wants to better understand typically turning points into your business, and this beyond the classical extrapolations that you make, it's going up or going down, but you never know exactly where the inflection point will be, and this is typically where we have developed this type of methodology about leading indicators. It's a methodology that basically, of course, will first assess the main drivers of your sales, of how the business is organized, and this within a global context or a regional context of macroeconomic indicators that we identify specifically for your business. But also you're always in your own context. It's a lot about downstream, if it's about understanding how your sales or your business will evolve. A lot of things are impacted downwards, and then it's coming up into your direction. And typically with leading indicators, it's also possible to better capture these evolutions. And in essence, it's all about capturing the evolution beyond the traditional extrapolations, as I said already. In a traditional way, we can always do extrapolations and understand seasonal patterns, but that is not allowing to capture the external world into your forecasts. And the name of the game is, of course, that at the end of the day, you want to have a good demand planning process with as much accuracy, but also with as much trends understanding as possible, so that you can see if there is a turning point coming or not, and then preparing, of course, your planning process, taking that into account. So if we go a bit further, so leading indicator, typically, and you see that on the right-hand side, this is a dotted line. But let me first start on the left-hand side. So as I said, traditionally, you will always do some extrapolations, even with some more complicated statistical methods. These methods are capable of both understanding seasonal patterns, but also typically the directions upwards, downwards. So that is the slope that you see. It's the orange slope. And these methods work pretty well as long as there is quite a stable environment. But from the moment there is an inflection point, as you can see there, it's very difficult for these methods to capture that because they will just continue to forecast the initial direction. On the right-hand side, there you see a dotted line. This is the indicator, and it can be multiple indicators. We will come back to that later. And typically it has predictive information. It's external information next to your business. It can have predictive information that is lagging for or leading, as there is a better terminology, for 1 month, but even 6 to 9 months is possible. So that it is predicting the slopes and also the trends into your business. And there you see, if we make typically then a model, a machine learning model based onto one indicator or more indicators, then we will develop a leading indicator model, and that is then the non-dotted green line that is capturing the target phenomenon. In this case, it's the actual sales volume, the dark line, and then you see that they are quite remarkable, looking towards each other in the same way. So, and this is typically what we are trying to obtain. The methodology behind that, and that is on the next slide, it's no magic. It's purely a scientific methodology that we are using. We have access to multiple databases that we are maintaining real time. So it's a set of regional but also global indicators. So it's following the Eurozone, the US zone, but also the Asian zones. We will extract the relevant indicators for your business. So in a general way. And in the second phase, we will match them also with what is the business value. Sometimes it's mathematically relevant, but not really business relevant. So we will do some filtering in a second phase. And once that filtering has been done, we will make a complicated or less complicated machine learning model. So we call that the leading indicator model. So that is then capturing as much as possible your business, and so where we try to anticipate much better these turning points. And in the next phase, of course, then we follow up that model together with the indicators. So we see how they are evolving. Sometimes the model will be calibrated, so we will make potentially a new model if we see some changes in the indicators that might affect your business, but also we will compare it with the traditional methods, and from there you will have a much better understanding of how your business is evolving or potentially would evolve in the coming months. So Gillian, if you allow me, I'll hand over to you so that you can position the inflation within the overall methodology that we have developed.
Yes, thank you, Christophe. So I think everybody has a story about inflation. From it was that my grandparents used to tell me that a bread costed the equivalent of 10 euro cents. Nowadays, that bread costs a lot more. If you go to the shop, you pay typically over 2 euros for such a bread. And in this case, on the slide, we see a similar effect occurring for coffee. So we see that the cup of coffee costed 25 cents in 1970, whereas in 2019 you would pay a lot more for that same cup of coffee. You would pay $1.59. So that means over 50 years, with the same amount of money, you can buy, or you could have bought 6 times more coffee for the same amount of money. So that's the result of that phenomenon called inflation. So what exactly is this thing called inflation? Well, we've seen it already in the coffee prices. So inflation, that's the rate at which the value of a currency is falling. and it's often used to indicate the general price level of goods and whether how much the price level of those goods and services is rising. So we need a type of measure in order to calculate how much inflation is. So typically that's done using consumer price indexes. That's a weighted average of prices of a basket of goods. So it measures the effect of weighted of the several important goods and services that are in everyday items that you buy. But typically that's the way it's calculated. Often it does not include house prices, for instance, which can have a different effect. Additionally, it's also reported often with and without energy prices and food prices, because those are typically more volatile than other types of goods. And the rule of thumb here, Western nations, developed nations, we want to have the consumer price index without the food and energy part in it of around 2%. So if we look at where we are, we can see that at the start of the graph, inflation was very high, a lot above that 2% goal. It was around 12.5% in the 80s. The period they called even the Great Inflation period. And then afterwards, it normalized more and more. And what you can see is that between the global financial crisis, which is after the gray area around 2010, up to the period around COVID, when COVID started, we saw that inflation was very, very stable, always around that 2% target. So that's exactly where the central banks are aiming to have inflation. Then we saw the peak that we all experienced over the past couple of years. Inflation reached 9% even in June 22 last year. And if we see where we are today, we see that it's still significantly above that 2% target. It's more going to between 3 and 4% currently. And so that comes also on top of that 9% that I described of last year. What is driving that inflation? Well, if you look at the drivers before the COVID peak happened, you could see that it was an equal mix of demand-driven inflation with supply-driven inflation. When COVID hit, and there were a lot of supply issues, so you could see that supply-driven inflation growing compared to the demand-driven inflation. The demand-driven inflation was even negative for a period of time, and that was a result of the lockdowns that we all saw, in which people bought a lot less goods and could save a lot more money. And then afterwards, when the lockdown periods were lessening and over, you could see the gigantic boom of both demand-driven inflation as well as supply-driven inflation. If you jump to the period of today, we can see that that's still around that between 3 and 4% of inflation, significantly above the 2% target. And it's looking, if you look at the past couple of months, as if there's going to be a small increase. So what could be, or what are the underlying reasons of that, inflation doesn't go back to that 2% target and is hovering around that 3 to 4% range over the last couple of months? Well, we've listed some topics here. So the first one is monetary policy versus fiscal policy. So I already told you, central banks, they have a target inflation. Western nation of developed nations, we typically want to have our inflation around that 2% target. This is both to keep inflation under control. We don't want high inflation because it makes it's not a good way in which economies or developed economies can operate. especially if you're developed and you can't have the really high growth levels that you can see in developing nations. Why not 0%? Well, we also want to stay away from deflation because it also has detrimental effects on the economy. Central banks, they don't also look only to inflation, and so they want to maximize also the employment. So they want to keep both at a reasonable pace. So they want to keep as low unemployment or as high employment, and they want to retain that 2% growth target. So how do they do that? Well, they have two main tools at their disposal: interest rates, at which the banks can deposit their surplus capital. They get a certain amount of money for that, as well as they can start buying assets. I think quantitative easing that we saw during the COVID times, in which the central banks bought a lot of government bonds, for instance. So the policy as of late, with the high inflation and the still strong economy, has been using measures to slow down the overheating economy by increasing interest rates, by reducing asset buying, or even building off the balance sheet, as we see what the Federal Reserve is doing. So monetary policy, we really want to reduce inflation and slow down the economy. If we look to what governments are doing, there we see that it's less focused on slowing down the economy. Governments want to keep consumers afloat. How do they do that? Well, we've seen energy prices support occurring, especially during 22, with the very high energy prices, especially in Europe. We've also seen measures to support the purchasing power during that time, especially for lower paid consumers. Over the past years, we've also seen climate support acts, Inflation Reduction Act also, which boosted, for instance, the production of goods like solar panels, but that also gives a boost to the economy. And as well, we see economic support packages, CHIPS Act, both in the EU and the US actually here, where governments are really incentivizing chip producers to produce locally, but this also increases the demand and increases the investment and boosts the economy, which is exactly the opposite what the monetary policy wants to achieve. So we've already talked about that climate support. This leads us to the topic of greenflation. And this is actually in effect related to the necessary transition going towards a green energy economy. However, this comes at a short-term potential disadvantage with inflation bursts. How does that actually get there? Well, the investments in green energy, being solar panels and others, that typically leads to higher short-term energy prices. Green energy currently is more expensive than the traditional sources. It also leads to a scarcity in raw materials needed to make those panels, or make those other green types of goods, such as batteries. For countries, they come with a higher initial investment costs, which boosts up the price. And so we already have, depending on the country, existing sources. So that comes with the lower costs on the short term than doing those large investments into green energy. And I don't have to remind you, of course, in the energy prices, they were a major driver of the previous high inflation wave. We saw oil prices rising up to $120 per barrel. And that has really been one of the drivers of the inflation as it's pushed up the prices for all products. A third factor is military spending. Military spending additionally creates a lot of demand on the economy. We see that, for instance, in the US, there was the defense bill with the aid to Ukraine, to Israel, and the Indo-Pacific of 95 billion US dollars. This creates a lot of demand and a lot of strain on resources, raw materials, and the workforce. So this again adds potentially a shorter term or medium term inflation into the system. And then finally, we have supply shortages. We've seen it in the graph with the underlying reasons for inflation. If you look at supply-driven inflation alone, you would almost account for 2% of inflation. It has improved a lot over the past couple of 2 years, but still there's a shortage in many components, mainly electrical components and chips, although this has improved considerably, but it's still way above what we saw before COVID outbreaks. So then we come to the question what to expect for the future. Do you expect a huge second inflation wave for the future like we saw 2 years ago? I don't think that's going to be the case, and there's still drivers that are pushing inflation upwards, but we don't see the huge drivers that we saw in the previous years. On the other side, do we expect the short-term reduction towards the 2% goal? Also no, and we've discussed all those drivers that are introducing inflationary pressures on the system. Those will remain there for the next months, even in the next years, and they will push inflation upwards so that we are not will not reach our 2% goal on the very short term. So I think the bottom line here is the truth is somewhere in between. We don't expect to reach the 2% goal, but we also don't expect a huge wave coming up. So how does that impact your company? Well, there's the impact of monetary policy. Central banks are very clear on that. They will continue to use their tools as long as they can to fight inflation as long as the economy stays afloat. So they will try to slow down the economy. They will try to reduce the demand by increasing interest rates, and that will make borrowing a lot more expensive. Below you can see the deposit rate of the ECB. Currently, they reduced the deposit rate slightly a couple of weeks ago. This makes, or the high interest rates makes borrowing more expensive, as banks see you as having or more riskful than just depositing it almost risk-free at the central bank for 3.75%. Also, this can create a focus shift from investing into future growth to making profit, which is an effect that we've seen over the past couple of years at companies. The next effect is cost increases. We see over the past couple of years, and we see that still continuing, is that the cost of raw materials is increasing. We also see energy pricing still being high and not at the higher levels that we saw over the course of 22, but still they are considerably above pre-COVID levels. Transportation costs also linked to blockage of the Suez Canal with the Houthi situation in Yemen. Additionally, food prices, although that looks more and more stabilizing. And what central banks really dread is the wage price spiral. Inflation leads to higher prices for goods, so workers demand higher wages, which leads to higher labor costs for companies. Also higher demand for goods again, which again boosts inflation, and you come into a spiral that is very difficult to stop. Also, if you look to the personal saving rate, we can see that consumers are becoming more and more conscious of what they spend. Saving rate is the amount of, or the percentage of the disposable income that they save instead of spending. And you can see that, well, that's a lot below what we see pre-COVID. We saw it skyrocketing during the COVID lockdowns, and people or consumers couldn't spend their money, so they saved it, and now they have spent it. The savings rate is now a lot below what we see before COVID, and this is an indication that there's less budget available for large ticket purchases and so on. A final part is the value chain impact of inflation, and that's linked to the bargaining power of your suppliers and your clients. If you have very strong suppliers and very strong clients, you might get margin squeezed because your suppliers, they force price increases onto you, and your clients, they say, oh no, we don't accept your price increases. So you might be required to eat that higher price for your goods with lower margins at the end. So what can you do about it? I think there's two parts that you can do about it. First thing you need to do is you need to, or you can map your supply chain and value chain situation, as we did here for a chemical player. And the chemical player provides goods that go into cars. They don't go immediately into cars. No, they provide it to tier ones. They use the product of that chemical player to build their goods. Those goods eventually end up in cars, who end up at dealerships, and who end up at consumers. So this creates a lot of visibility. It shows you where potentially the strong players are that will block price increases, as I've mentioned. And it also allows you to monitor how the demand evolves in each echelon of that value chain. We've listed here several proxies that are very relevant. The demand of the consumer that buys vehicles is captured by the vehicle sales. The proxy of that captures the demand of the vehicle manufacturer or the OEM is the motor vehicle assemblies. The proxy that captures the tier one's behaviors is the industrial production of motor vehicle parts and goods. And then further upstream, the proxy for their own and their competitors' behaviors can be captured by the industrial production for auto parts and allied goods. So why do we call it proxy? Well, it's not necessarily the sales of that company that end up in the consumer's hands. No, it tries to mimic that behavior or to copy that behavior by looking at the total picture of the consumer, but it does not take into account what the exact behavior is of the consumer towards that upstream supplier. So if you win market share or lose market share, and that's not captured by looking at such evolutions. So what you can do once you have mapped that is you can build monitoring dashboards. So here we build dashboards that mimic or that capture the behavior of the downstream players in the value chain. We've captured the behavior of the purple line, which is the vehicle sales, the light blue line, which is the motor vehicle assemblies, and the green line, which is the motor vehicle parts production. What you can derive from those dashboards is that before COVID, automotive value chains have been very well in sync. Those three signals are behaving the same way. They were all heavily impacted by COVID, but you can see that the rebound and the period afterwards was very different behaviors in those signals. You can see that the purple line, the vehicle sales towards the end of the graph was very high, meaning that there was a very high demand for new vehicles. But because, for instance, for the shortages, semiconductor shortages and so on, the production of vehicles was a lot lower. So there was kind of a demand-supply imbalance there, which you can clearly see in those graphs. Next to demand or downstream behaviors, we could also observe that behavior in the inventory modeling. And so if you look at the green line, which is the domestic auto inventories, because of those shortages, you could see the domestic vehicle inventories really falling down, really dropping off because there was a lot more demand for cars than they were being produced. So all the cars on inventory were immediately gone. Whereas we see different behavior in the blue line, which is the inventories for motor vehicles and parts. There we saw an explosion, and that's actually a behavior of that you can capture of the OEM. The OEM was really asking parts producers to continue supplying goods that they were putting in cars that they were not able to finish. So you could see a lot of that inventory building up then in the value chain. Next to that, you can also do price monitoring of your value chains. Here we linked the sales of vehicles with the price of used vehicles. If there's less availability of those new vehicles, you see the price skyrocketing for used vehicles. And yeah, that's what you're able to monitor. So once one of those signals starts to normalize, you can see that, or you can expect also that a couple of months in the future, your own demand will normalize. So that's more using those insights qualitatively. Next, in the next step, you can also use those insights quantitatively in a forecast model. Where you combine indicators. Those can be indicators intuitively linking to your business or very closely linked to your business, like vehicle sales, which is a logical behavior. If vehicle sales increases, then a couple of months later, in this case 3, you see the demand of that upstream chemical player also increasing. It can also be less intuitively linked by consumer confidence, for instance. If consumer confidence increases, then a couple of months later, people start buying new vehicles. They don't do that straight away. They have to feel confident for a couple of months before they start buying vehicles. And then again, X months later, you will see that effect occurring in your sales. And here we see the typical effect that Christophe described in the start of the presentation. If you have your demand behavior here, what statistical methods will do if for 1.5 years your sales has been decreasing, well, they will extrapolate that behavior into the future. So that's that light blue old winters line that you see. Whereas if you can identify the leading indicators for that business, then you're able to determine months in advance, and that decreasing trend is not going to continue, and that you will see a period of stabilization. So to wrap it up, so there's a lot of risks in inflation for companies, mainly downside risks, leading to profitability changes or margin changes or deteriorations even, as well as potentially top line changes, consumers buying less goods. So there's risk for your company. We expect inflation to remain high, remain above the target. Yet there's no huge second wave that we expect currently. What can you do about it is you can try to visualize the risk by mapping out your value chain where you are based. And then you can monitor demands, inventories, prices, even orders in your value chain in order to see, okay, is there a pickup in the demand? Is there prices that are increasing somewhere at which I have to react, yes or no? And if you want to take it further, you can also build your own forecast model based upon that type of information. Using those external sales drivers, and those drivers, they are not a replacement for the sales team or the sales inputs that you have to get in order to get a complete picture. No, it's really an additional pair of eyes, an additional view on how your demand can evolve in the next months, where the risks are, where the potential is. And you can put them next to each other, and you need the multiple sources of information in order to make an educated forecast, an educated consensus forecast on where your future will be. So that's it, what I wanted to share with you today. There's still some time for questions and answers. Hopefully answers. So you can put your questions in the chat.
Yeah, there is a question, Gillian. So we have some time left. First of all, thanks for your nice introduction about these global forces and how to model that into your business to better understand what could happen. And I have a question here from Andre Kester. So where he is talking about the make-to-order operating model. Where he said how we focus, and I don't expect you to answer that in detail now, of course, but it's more just an illustration of a potential question. So where he says where do we focus? The cost push demand driven inflation for this type of business, and the same for the make to stock. So where the person in question is then asking what type of model should I use, I think, to model the inflation, ARIMA, states model, state space, or the whole printers model. So I think we gave already some answers to that with the leading indicator methodology that we propose. So he's also talking about the baskets to use, which I think is a very relevant question in case of automotive, food and bev, metal fabrication, because indeed it are all specific areas with different indicators. So maybe you can give some comments about that, but without, of course, bringing all the answers into this short time.
Yeah, sure. Without going too technical, indeed, you need models that can take that external information into account, and specifically for a make-to-order situation, where you can say, okay, I only make my goods according to what my clients want. Why do I need leading indicator forecasting? That would also be a good question. You would also need to reserve capacity, make decisions what raw materials to buy, and so on. So if you get insights on where the future is heading to, you might reserve those capacities. You might buy in sufficient raw materials in order to be able to sustain that production.
Yeah. And but I also would propose to Andre Kester, which asked the question. So we will be happy to do an intake call with Andre, with our team. In order to capture his specific questions and needs, and see from there, yeah, how we could support him to a kind of an initial workshop. Typically, we work with a pilot, and then customers can choose how they want to move along within a given business unit, or more business units, as they start to know us and how we deal with their challenges. I have another question, and I think then we could finalize it more. What are the inflation drivers? Do you see a lot of differences between Europe and US, or in your perspective, is that very similar, or do you see some main differences in these economies?
Yeah, there is some difference, and the inflation in the US has remained higher. But the good news is there. Also, the economy and the growth has been higher than what we've seen in Europe. And so there's a bit difference. The inflation is still higher, but on the other side, the economy is still doing better in the US than what we see in Europe currently.
I think that's clear. A lot of things to think about. Gillian, again, thank you very much for your very interesting comments on inflation within a broader perspective, and how we should model our businesses with the leading indicator approach. We will now finalize the webinar, and thanks to all the participants for your attention, and speak to you next time. Bye-bye.